Okay. I believe I was properly introduced on Monday, but just to confirm, I'm Gordon Braden. This is the second of this year's Clark Lectures, and this is lecture number 2. All shook up. Some of you may already guess why the title, but we'll get to that. I left off last time with a discussion of the afterlife of one of Sappho's briefest fragments. My metaphor, which I'll repeat here, is of scraps of lyric DNA dispersed across the body of European poetry, germinating where the soil proves favorable. I'll be coming to more of those scraps in my third lecture. My subject today is something easier to get into focus, the fortunes of Sappho's best known and most influential survival, which may even be a complete poem. And there it is. He seems to me, I'll just read the English, he seems equal to the gods to me, the man who sits opposite you and listens nearby to your sweet voice and lovely laughter. Truly, that sets my heart fluttering in my breast. For when I look at you for a moment, then it is no longer possible for me to speak. My tongue has snapped at once, a subtle fire has stolen beneath my flesh. I see nothing with my eyes, my ears hum, cold sweat covers me, a trembling seizes me all over. I am greener than grass, and I seem to be little short of dying. The Greek text bristles with problems. Those familiar with the Greek will notice that I've made some eclectic decisions about what readings to go with. The conclusion of the poem is particularly troublesome. For the last 2 words of Greek, I give what is now the generally accepted editorial conjecture there, phainomena autai. I seem to be a little short. Well, yeah, it goes back to the previous line. Give what is now the generally accepted conjecture. Etienne and Orsini, the 2 16th century editors, whom I will be discussing at more length next time, give instead apnus, without breath. Certainly a reasonable addition to the speaker's already long list of physiological disorders, though the word also introduces an unacceptable hiatus with the concluding vowel of the preceding word. There's no manuscript evidence for apnus. The problem is that the sole source of the text, that famous discussion of the literary sublime, to which I alluded last time, ascribed in manuscript to one Dionysius Longinus, though that name is almost certainly some kind of scribal confusion, moves directly from phainomai, I seem, into a brief unmetrical continuation that itself terminates without entirely making sense. Alapan tolmatan epe kai peneta. That may have been part of a 17th line by which the poem continued in at least 2 possible directions. Either all things must be suffered because of poverty, or all things must be dared because of poverty, or maybe something else we're not thinking of. The conjecture Etienne and Orsini print supplies a metrically acceptable conclusion to the 16th line, after which they simply ignore the rest, presumably as a copyist's faux pas. Most, though not all, of the poem's very numerous translators and imitators have also ignored it and followed their lead. Doing so gives the poem, when you notice it, as many contemporaries critic, though it does take a minute, is an almost shocking shapeliness, pirouetting on that opening verb, phainotai. We begin with a seeming deification and end with the seeming death. Anne Carson's translation gives the parallel particular emphasis. He seems to me, in line 1, I seem to me, in line 16. That's how Carson handles it, really emphasizing the parallel. An argument could be made that this kind of artful subtlety, enclosing the physical and psychic turmoil of stanzas 2 through 4 in a kind of deliberate shimmer, it's all seeming in here somehow, is not something we should be looking for in archaic Greek poetry, though that also seems like a willfully self-denying way to come at it. And in any case, why decline the uncanny gift of a stronger poem if that is the result? Versions of this not entirely rhetorical question come up again and again in dealing with Sappho's remains. Cutting the poem off after line 16 puts the emphasis on apparent death, an emphasis echoed elsewhere in two of the longer fragments. The first of these, precisely in its tattered state, is now one of Sappho's most unforgettable poems, and I will be spending more time with it in my last lecture. It remembers a leave-taking with an anonymous woman who addresses Sappho by name in line 5. And the line there is, "I honestly want to die." The first line of the poem, the first line is a cry of pain. I honestly want to die. The second fragment from the same parchment begins with the woman's name, Gongula, and is less clear about context, but comparably despairing. I get no pleasure from being above the earth, and a longing grips me to die and see the dewy, lotus-covered banks of Acheron. These fragments weren't identified and published until 1902, but their tone fits with the aura surrounding Sappho's name for much of the 19th and 20th centuries as the story of Sapphic love arches towards suicide. Literally with Aimée Vivienne, in a more metaphorical way with Marguerite Yourcenar, whose heroine in Sappho, or Suicide, the concluding monologue in Fires, Feu in French, intentionally, if unsuccessfully, risks death as a trapeze artist. Behind this is the tenacious legend of Sappho's own suicide as a result of her love for the ferryman Phaon, for which she is said to have lost interest in women and traveled to the western coast of Greece in order to throw herself off a cliff. No such person is named in any surviving fragment of her poetry. Numerous women are named and no male love objects, and there is no mention of the story until well after her death. My own suspicion is that the legend grew, as legends about ancient authors have often been thought to grow, to provide a context for motifs in Sappho's own poetry. Gregory Nagy has a fascinatingly detailed article showing how this might have happened, though asserting that was not exactly his intent. Phaon, in any case, will not be playing much of a role in these lectures. His absence will be one of the eccentricities of my discussion generally, but I think it's justifiable, at the very least as a thought experiment. The death which the speaker courts in what we have of Sappho's poetry is, I believe, not literal suicide, but an emotional and somatic vertigo, disabling but also survivable, brought on by unusually troubled feelings of desire. The climax, as I take it to be, of Fin de Taimoy, is the incandescent example of this. There is a strain of English translations of it from the 17th into the 19th centuries that begins the tumult while effacing any hint of seeming from the last line. No, that's not it. Well, but this is a sample of translations of that last line of the poem. I sigh, I tremble, and I die, William Bowles, 1685. I fainted, sunk, and died away, Ambrose Phillips, 1711. Now I pant, oh, ow, now expired, George Jeffreys, 1754. I see, I hear, I feel, and melt away, George Dyer, 1802. Retrospectively, these look like tentative drafts for Percy Shelley's famous or notorious curtain line to Epipsychidion, 1821. I pant, I sink, I tremble, I expire. That is Sappho in the voice of English Romanticism, or at least in one of its voices. Robert Lowell, who makes the poem the first Sapphic triptych in his Imitations, 1961, perhaps belongs in this company. I am greener than the greenest green grass, I die. Unquote. Shelley's fellow romantic, Lord Byron, translating apparently by way of Catullus around 1820, has a more worldly take. Quote, such pangs my nature sinks beneath and feels a temporary death. Sappho's poem attracted imitators almost as soon as Henri Etienne printed it in an appendix to his second edition of the Anacreontia in 1556, though they have often shifted things. Ronsard's French, that's what I've got up there. Ronsard's French recrafting appeared in the same year, simultaneously more demure and more egotistical than his source. I am a demigod when, sitting face to face with you, my dear beloved, I listen to your talk mixed with a gracious smile, a smile that holds my heart imprisoned. Contemplating your eyes, I swoon with astonishment and cannot draw a single breath from my poor sides. A demigod is a modest step down from a god, but phainetaimoi has become an assured je suis, with no hint of seeming. The French poet sounds far more in control of the situation, and he confidently takes over the position occupied in Sappho's poem by the unnamed man, who dominates the first stanza with his apparent deification before disappearing from the text. This change dramatically simplifies our sense of the situation. Ronsard's male speaker is grandly in love with the female addressee and is telling her so. The speaker's gender is grammatically specified, the addressee's is not, but there's no real uncertainty about it. Ronsard is sufficiently taken with the setup here, the lover collapsing into emotional and physical chaos in his beloved's presence, that he effectively rewrites the same poem twice for his sonnets for Hélène, 1578, once as a sonnet, up there, when I drink deeply of the amorous sparkle which comes from your beautiful eyes, mine own are dazzled. Shaken, I feel neither spirit nor reason, and my whole body shudders as if drunk with love. And shortly afterwards, in the same lyric series, a chanson. When I talk on, sitting beside you, my whole heart is tossed about, I tremble in my nerves, and my pulse stops. To Constantia, singing, one of Shelley's last poems, recovered from his papers after his death in 1822, incorporates phainetaimoi into a similar scene. Her voice is hovering o'er my soul, it lingers, o'ershadowing it with soft and lulling wings. The blood and life within those snowy fingers teach witchcraft to the instrumental strings. My brain is wild, my breath comes quick, the blood is listening in my frame, and thronging shadows fast and thick fall on my overflowing eyes. My heart is quivering like a flame as morning dew that in the sunbeam dies. I am dissolved in these consuming ecstasies. In its reception history, Sappho's poem keeps turning into a swooning tete-a-tete. In the late 1570s, Philip Sidney, not yet an English knight, though he had contacts in France and had been awarded a French title of nobility in 1572 during a tour of the continent, also studied Etienne's 1556 volume, which he likely brought back with him from France. From it, he lifted an anglicized version of what he calls Anacreon's kind of verse, da-dump, 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 dump. That's simplifying. For one of his experiments in English quantitative verse, and incorporated the result into the eclogues that he has his shepherds sing in his prose romance, Arcadia. The unrhymed poem is presented in 6 stanzas of differing lengths, the first 5 beginning with, my muse, what ails this ardor? And the last with, my muse, I yield, my muse, sing. The poem has affinities with the first poem in the Anacreontia, a kind of origin story of the speaker's poetic vocation. But the second stanza is specifically based on the new Sappho poem that Sidney would have found in Etienne's appendix. And this is the second stanza. That is, in case you're curious, water. My muse, what ails this ardor? My eyes be dim, my limbs shake. My voice is hoarse, my throat scorched. My tongue to this my roof cleaves, my fancy amazed, my thoughts dulled. My heart doth ache, my life faints, my soul begins to take leave. So great a passion all feel, to think a sore so deadly, I should so rashly rip up. The metrical experiment is on the leaden side, and Sidney never repeats it. But the poem's placement in Arcadia is fascinating. The poem is assigned to the shepherdess Cleophila in fictional conversation with her muse. We have to wait until the penultimate stanza for the muse herself to say something. But when she does, she reveals surprising information that is by then, for anyone who has been paying attention, not actually all that much of a surprise. Quote, Lo, here the author of all thy harms. Lo, here she that only can redress thee. Of her I will demand help. Oh, your girlfriend is here. There she is. Let's get her to help. The object of Cleophilus' ardor is another woman, whom the muse is finally volunteering to help this smitten shepherdess win over. This is, in other words, a lesbian love song. Or so it would seem to the shepherds listening to it if they gave it any real thought, though readers of the Arcadia already know that Cleophila is actually the male warrior Pyrocles in drag, disguising himself, quite successfully for the most part, in order to get close to the Princess Philoclea, with whom he has been in love since, wouldn't you know it, before he met her. This gaudy tangle will eventually work itself out to the predictable happy ending, but the principals will have to traverse some complicated and even dangerous territory to get there when the king and queen of Arcadia separately fall in love with Cleophila. The latter sees through Pyrocles' disguise and knows she is lusting after a man, but the former, well, does not. All of this suggests a gamesome savvy on Sidney's part about Sappho and her poetry, and how that poetry might, as we currently enjoy saying, destabilize the gendered scenarios of early modern romance. The song itself, though, does not directly engage the trickiest aspect of Sappho's poem. Arcadia places it within a giddy and sometimes farcical quadrilateral of desire, but Phainotymoi carries within itself a less easily parsed configuration. There are officially three characters present in Cleophila's song: herself, her muse, her beloved. But those first two personae bleed into each other. Thy heated heart, my seat is, wherein I burn, thy breath is, my voice too hot to keep in. That's Cleophila singing to her muse. And the underlying story remains, yet again, that of a guy and a girl. The most challenging and controversial aspect of Phainotymoi, though, is that it presents a triangle, desire's maddening three-body problem, something more difficult to come to terms with. The intricate and often secret cross-currents of triangular desire have, of course, received some influential theoretical attention over the last several decades to varying effect. Carson, in Eros the Bittersweet, her venturesome and influential attempt to get at Sappho from the inside, locates triangulation in one form or another at the heart of classical Greek love poetry. It provides the disruption that serves, quoting Carson, to represent Eros as deferred, defied, obstructed, hungry, organized around a radiant absence. Carson links this development with the arrival in Sappho's lifetime of alphabetic literacy, which I will be discussing in my next lecture. Efforts have been made to get rid of the triangle in Phainotymoi. One carefully worked out recent argument by the late and greatly missed Jack Winkler has it that oner otis, that's the relevant Greek words, that man whoever, is not actually there. He is, quoting Winkler, a rhetorical device, a rhetorical cliche, not an actor in the imagined scene, unquote. The scene itself is, as in Ronsard's imitation, a scene between two lovers, and the derangement powerfully dramatized in the body of the poem is that of erotic passion itself. Winkler argues that critics have avoided seeing this because of, quote, androcentric premises, unquote, uneasy in the presence of so intense a depiction of lesbian courtship. That is, this actually is a lesbian love poem. The most extreme alternative theory, now generally seen as bizarre, but advocated in 1913 by no less a figure than Wilemovitz, who's come up before, is that the man is not only there, but is the bridegroom who is part of the audience for a traditional makarismos, celebratory praise and blessing for the woman he is about to marry. The poet's own participation in the ceremony is itself detached and entirely chaste. The terrain between these two possibilities, between Winkler's and Wilemovitz's, is, you know, what might be between these two possibilities is uncomfortable and treacherous. Even those not troubled with the prospect of lesbian love can be unsure of what to do with the emotions at play in an erotic triangle, especially one that crosses the boundaries that this one does. The ready term jealousy is upsetting enough, but hardly begins to cover it. I do think the triangle is there in Sappho's poem, and that it contributes to the special fury of the distress that the poem articulates. The way I understand the situation is that the speaker's passion for the woman to whom she is speaking induces a deeply empathetic sense of identification with her. Precisely because of that identification, the speaker can see her victorious male rival just the way she believes or fears her beloved sees him, like a god. Men are notoriously good at that, sometimes without half trying. And in that knowledge, the speaker feels intimidation and hopelessness searing her to the point of death. If you think about it, that's actually close to Wilemowicz's theory, except for the chastity part. In accord with my vow to stay as far away from reconstructing things as I can, I won't go any farther than that. What I will take away is that something in Sappho's situation, which, as always, may well have been an imagined situation, allowed her to give voice to a uniquely fierce fusion of arousal and despair that in its extremity became a touchstone for anyone presuming to write about love. Even writers writing about a different kind of love, and I don't know any participant in Sappho's Nachleben who writes from anything like the situation implied in Feine Timoi, can find themselves following her example. Plato, notoriously ambivalent about poets, still read them and remembered them. And in his Phaedrus has Socrates suddenly remember Sappho's poem when giving his rapturous account of how the enlightened soul grows wings. Now, quoting from the Phaedrus, he who is newly initiated, when he sees a godlike face or form which is a good image of beauty, shudders at first, and something of the old awe comes over him. Then, as he gazes, he reveres the beautiful one as a god. And as he looks upon her, a reaction from his shuddering comes over him with sweat and unwanted heat. Now, in this process, the whole soul throbs and palpitates. And there are verbal parallels there that are unmistakable. Actually, I put in the text up there, passage that I left didn't read right now, the part about where the soul grows feathers and turns into a bird. You can actually find that in the verb of the there in the second stanza. The heart flutters in my breast. There is a little like Hannibal Lecter scaring. Now that in the process, the whole soul throbs and palpitates, unquote. 2 millennia later, after Sappho's reappearance in Western literacy, Racine makes an indelible mark on French literature when Feine Timoi sets the key for the most famous speech in his most famous play. I saw him, I blushed, turned pale at the sight of him. Confusion ruled my distracted soul. My eyes no longer saw, I could not speak, I felt my whole body both cold with sweat and burning. And while so far I have been mostly dealing with encounters where it is entirely plausible, if not documentable, that the later author is openly conscious of Sappho's part in it, my discussion is about to open onto something much wider, ultimately elusive, I suppose, though, well, you'd be the judge from my next example. For a dozen or so years, I gave the 2-semester undergraduate survey lectures required for the comparative literature major at the University of Virginia. It was, without embarrassment on my part, a greatest hits course in Western literature, from the ancient Greeks to something close to the present day. I still believe in such courses, though it gets harder to coax people into teaching them. And largely for that reason, the one at Virginia eventually lapsed. Most of the readings were narratives of one sort or another, with a few plays thrown in, generally presented in chronological order from Homer onward. Lyric poetry, though, the kind of literature I happen to care most about, presents special problems for a course such as this, and I gave it special treatment. Rather than mix lyrics in with everything else, I decided to extract them from the chronology and group them at intervals throughout the year under particular topics, each group consisting of a half dozen or so poems in various languages from various eras. The idea was, in each case, to trace a common lyric topic as it was treated across time. In each group, the final text was a popular song. Among other things, I wanted to give the students a sense of the literary historical perspective behind overly familiar themes that the students were likely taking for granted. This format gave me the chance to do something I wanted to do anyway, to begin not with the epic and manly gravitas of Homer, but with Sappho, singing of lesbian love. If students took this as a suggestion that this was where the great tradition of Western literature took its start, in a venue awash in possibly suspect Eastern influences, artistic and otherwise, from Lydia just across the Middle Strait, I was not going to disabuse them of it. It would probably do them good to think that, if only for a while. As you can guess by now, the first work was Fine Taimoi, with the Greek text and a prose translation in front of them. After several offspring of that poem, some of them, such as Ronsard's poem, obvious choices, we ended up in 1957. The text in front of me actually does say, oh, yeah, yeah. That's Elvis Presley singing. Some younger members of the audience today might not be familiar with his work, but take my word for it, the song was very popular in its time, when I was 10, and was #1 on Billboard for 9 weeks. For practical reasons, Elvis Presley was given joint credit for the song, and it is, in a quite legitimate sense, his song, forever associated with his name, but he did not himself write it. He readily admitted that he was no kind of songwriter. He may have suggested the refrain, "All Shook Up," though there are other stories about where it came from. The one I like has a record executive shaking a bottle of Pepsi-Cola. The real credit for the song goes to Otis Blackwell, an African-American songwriter from Brooklyn who claimed never to have met Presley and to have turned down chances to do so, but who is also credited with a number of, as you can see there, a number of songs that Presley is remembered for, such as "Don't Be Cruel," "Return to Sender," as well as some Elvis-adjacent hits, such as "Great Balls of Fire." It is possible that someone or other involved in All Shook Up had at some point read some translation of Fine Taimoi, but there is also no particular reason to think so, or even to think anyone involved would have recognized Sappho's name. The odds are probably against it, and in any case, whether anyone did or not is irrelevant to the point I am making. All Shook Up simplifies the model offered by Sappho's poem in something like the way Ronsard does. Aside from the inconsequential reference to "my friends," there are only two characters here and no triangle. Boy loves girl, or boy wants girl is maybe more like it. Despite the agitation, I'm a little mixed up, but I'm feeling fine. The mood is distinctly less despairing than that of Fine Taimoi. A cure for boy's distress is openly specified, to have the girl that I love so fine, and isn't presented as altogether unlikely. Indeed, as soon as he says that, she touches his hand, widely considered a good sign, and suddenly he's reporting how hot her lips are, an even better sign. In this environment, you wouldn't call "Who do you think when you have such look?" bitterly sarcastic. And the climactic item in Boy's inventory of torments is downright sunny. I'm proud to say she's my buttercup. Still, the song is an inventory of torments. That is its very real kinship with Sappho's poem, despite the obvious differences between them. The inventory itself has a transhistorical feel to it. In his discussion of Fine Taimoi, Franco Ferrari sees an uncanny closeness to the list of clinical indicators of panic attack disorder given in DSM-3. Both Sappho and Presley Blackwell sing of uncontrollable trembling, inability to speak, a frighteningly accelerated heartbeat, and something like a near-death experience. Sappho adds blindness and ringing in the ears. One particular detail coming halfway through the modern song and then repeated at the climax rewards special attention. She touched my hand, what a chill I got. Her lips are like a volcano that's hot. You may need to listen closely, though actually the audio here was quite clear. You may need to listen closely to be sure Presley sings chill rather than thrill. Thrill would work as far as the sense goes, but we can be confident that Blackwell wrote chill because of the contrast it sets up for hot. Agonizing extremes of temperature are fused within a single couplet that is the peak moment of the song's eroticism, simultaneous or nearly simultaneous ice and fire. One of the great cliches of Western love poetry, though cliche is too flip and dismissive a term. The great disseminator of that turn of phrase, let's call it, of the paradoxical style of which it is the most famous instance, is of course Francesco Petrarca, known in English as Petrarch, the immensely influential 14th century Italian love poet who was behind so much of what passes as commonplace in Western love poetry and was a comparably influential propagandist for the study of classical literature, in effect the founder of humanism as a cultural movement. To his dismay, Petrarch was never able to learn Greek, let alone East Aeolic Greek, and as a consequence was in no position to have any first-hand knowledge of Sappho, but literary history has some unexpected byways. The American poet Mary Hewitt takes an interesting snapshot of this one, this byway, in the two versions of Fine Etymoe that she produces in the mid-19th century. Okay, that's one. The first in 1845, accepted for publication, I love this, accepted for publication by Edgar Allan Poe in the same issue of the Broadway Journal as The Premature Burial, she calls a translation. In it, she expands less than a line of the Greek into a quatrain, the fourth of 5, that unpacks the icy fire as a chronological sequence. And o'er my cheek with rapid gush, I feel the burning life tide dart, then backward like a torrent rush, all icy cold upon my heart. 9 years later, in what she labels an imitation, the Petrarchan trope is still visible in some wording taken over from the translation, but made less dramatic by being diluted and moved up to the second quatrain of 4. If when thou utterest low words of greeting, to feel through every vein the torrent pour, then back again the top tide swift retreating, leave me all powerless, silent as before. But Hewitt has at the same time made the Sappho-Petrarch nexus tighter and more emphatic by casting the entire poem as a conspicuous imitation of one of the Italian poet's most popular sonnets. If to repeat my name when none may hear me, to find thy thoughts with all my thoughts inwove, to languish where thou art not, to sigh when near thee, oh, if this be to love thee, if this be to love thee, I do love. If faithfulness and love, an unfeigning heart, to sweet yearning, a courteous desire, if chaste desires kindled in a noble fire, a long wandering in a blind aberrant, so on and so on and so on to the end of the poem, if they be to love, then I love. That is Petrarch Canzoniere 224. The icy fire appears in the second tercet of Petrarch's sonnet, to burn from afar and freeze close by, as the penultimate item on a list of increasingly dire manifestations of the speaker's passion. Thomas Wyatt imitates this sonnet, this Petrarchan sonnet, twice in composing a compact digest of his own neo-Petrarchan torments, if amorous faith, on heart unfeigned, if waker care, if southern pain color. If these are symptoms of love, then I'm in love. It is, in this sense, Petrarchism's Fine Etymoe. And Hewitt's merging of the two poems implies an insightful perception of their literary kinship. Sealing that kinship in Fine Etymoe is the lover's cold sweat, hydros psychros, brought on by the fire that runs under his skin and makes her shiver. The phrase deserves an even closer look. For one thing, the hot-cold juxtaposition in Fine Timoi is not in its own time an especially isolated one. Anacreon, working maybe a generation after Sappho, elaborates a literally striking version of it. Once again, love has struck me like a blacksmith and with a great hammer and dipped me into the wintry torrent. Anacreon may well have taken his inspiration from Sappho, possibly in a competitive spirit. Either of them may have prompted further versions of the conceit that can be traced in later phases of Greek poetry, such as the lover burned by honey in an epigram attributed to the Hellenistic poet Meleager in the Greek anthology. Carson draws attention to these as instances of what she takes to be a defining instinct for paradox in the poetry she is talking about. And there, ereo de daute kuk ereo, kai mainomai, kai ku mainomai. Anacreon again. Once again, I love and I do not love. I am mad and I am not mad. And the currency of such language itself bears on the chronic problem of establishing Sappho's text, since it is part of what makes us confident that idros psychros is indeed the correct reading at that point in the text. That phrase comes down to us in an impossibly hypermetrical line, and some proposals for amending it involve removing the adjective psychros, cold. David Campbell's Loeb text, currently the most accessible edition of the Greek, reads, kade midros kachetai, sweat flows over me, but the cold is not there. This does not greatly change the sense, since the presence of shivering is asserted in the next clause. Tromos, trembling, is the next word. But the author of the treatise on literary sublimity, who was not named Longinus, but so what, the author of the treatise on literary sublimity that preserves the poem for us accompanies it with some effervescent appreciation that suggests not only that psychros should stay, but also that the sublimity of the passage resides precisely in its dramatization of desire as a giddy cascade of comparably paradoxical states. And now quoting from the treatise, are you not amazed how in contradiction, kathupanatioses, she both freezes, psychotai, and burns, is irrational and sane, is afraid and nearly dead, so that we observe in her not one single emotion, but a concourse of emotions. All this, of course, happens to people in love, unquote. I like that, of course. As Carson shows, this way of looking at it finds its place in later Greek literature. The romance novelist Heliodorus glosses the happy ending of his prose romance Ethiopica, so, quote, absolute contrarieties, and the English translation there is trying to deal with a superlative form of the adjective, an antioteta, the most contradictoriest, were fitted together as one sound. Joy interwoven with grief, tears mixed with laughter, total gloom turning into festive delight, unquote. In the text of Fine Timoi that I presented at the beginning of this lecture, I adopt Dennis Page's emendation at line 13, which not only preserves the adjective that makes this sweat something different from ordinary sweat, but also confirms the aesthetic that an ancient literary critic was so excited to find in Sappho's poem that, who knows, it may have jangled his transcription of it. He is, shall we say, crediting her with the discovery, or maybe that's the invention, of the oxymoron, the yoked affirmation of incompatible opposites, as the master trope of desire, or at least of the poetry of desire. We have evidently been unable to do without it ever since. The format was announced at the first lecture. We'll take questions at the end of the last lecture, and I'm happy to do so. Well, for now, that's all you get.